Erstens, sie wollte keine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte kompromisslos die einzige Macht oder alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Non sia il carcere che umilia il nostro vigore di vita.
I was born in Leipzig, Germany. I live with my parents and also brother in a nice neighborhood on Beethoven Street. We got along well with our mostly non-Jewish neighbors, but everything changed one day. We heard people marching in the street singing, "When the blood of the Jews will be on our knives, we will be happy." We moved to a Jewish neighborhood where we learned that some Jews were leaving Germany. My father dismissed them, saying,
"It's so stupid. It's terrible to be a refugee. This is a country of Schiller, Goethe und Mozart. Nothing will happen to us in such a cultured country."
When I was born in 1915, the population of my hometown Malin in Ukraine was 90% Jewish. In fact, until I was 8 years old, I spoke only Yiddish. Long before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, like so many other families, we left Malin to find better opportunities in Kiev. Lucky us. Since within 2 months of their invasion, the Nazis killed over 1,000 Jews in Malin, effectively exterminating the population that was left. Mamzer.
How would you like to go to China? It was Mo Levin, the boss of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, calling me in Havana. The Joint, as we called it, resettled Jewish refugees and set up programs to meet the basic needs of Jews around the world who needed help.
on the morning of October 28, 1938, it surprises me how few people know about this crisis. Just a few days before the infamous Kristallnacht, I needed to be at school very early for a special event. 2 policemen knocked on our apartment door as I was about to leave.
Where are your parents, young girl?
Sleeping. They went into my parents' bedroom and announced that we were all being sent to Poland. No reason was given. I had to go wake up my brother. We could not take anything with us. The 2 policemen took us to the crammed gymnasium of the nearby Jewish school, where we saw other people of Polish origin from our neighborhood. All the German Polish Jews in Leipzig were being processed at the school, and then were going to be sent to the Leipzig train station to board trains for deportation to Poland.
I was in Havana working for the Joint in '39, the year we tried and failed to get the 937 German Jewish refugees on the SS St. Louis first into Cuba and then into the United States. But now, in 1941, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees from Germany and elsewhere were pouring into Shanghai. It was an open port. No visas were necessary. Chinese didn't care who came in, nor apparently did the Japanese occupiers of Shanghai. The Joint had been sending money to a committee of Shanghai Jewish leaders, but they were overwhelmed and needed someone to run programs, feeding, housing, and ultimately relocating the refugees. The Joint hoped that I could bring order out of the chaos there and find ways to relocate all those who could travel. I left Havana and got there in May. The needs were overwhelming.
Shortly after we arrived at the school where we were to be processed for deportation to Poland, my father started having trouble breathing. He called over a doctor who surprisingly arranged to have him go to the nearby hospital. As he left, my brother shouted,
"We will never see you again. We will be in Poland and you will be in Germany."
As we waited and worried, I overheard a woman pleading with the police commander, "Please don't send me to Poland. I have all the papers necessary to go to America." The police commander sent her home to get her papers. That gave me an idea. I persuaded my mother to tell that same commander that their doctor had sent father to the hospital and we needed to care for him. So could we please go home? It was worth a shot.
I was drafted into the Soviet army to fight the Nazi invaders. And in the spring of 1945, we liberated a transit camp in Botoșani, Romania, in which the Nazis had imprisoned all kinds of people. Most of the Jews had been shot dead by the time we arrived. We did find large numbers of Romanian communists, along with a lot of foreigners, especially French, both men and women. Suffice it to say, that experience was hideous. I don't like to talk about being there.
When the commander heard her speaking German with a perfect Leipzig accent which she had developed over the years, he thought she was German and not Polish, and had been gathered by mistake. He released us. Only 5 people were released that day, and we were 3 of them.
The Jewish refugees were concentrated in a part of Shanghai, a neighborhood called Hankou, living under Japanese jurisdiction. The area had been badly bombed by Japanese invaders of China, and when I arrived, a large section of Hankou was still a mass of ruins. The kitchen from which these Jewish refugees from Europe received one scanty daily meal was primitive. Often in Shanghai's torrential rains, the kitchen floor was knee-deep in icy water. In June, I issued an ultimatum to Mo. This is not a one-person job. You have to send someone else here to help me. Manny Siegel had worked with me in Havana and indicated that he would like to work with me in Shanghai. Either you send Manny or someone else, but this is not a problem I can handle alone.
When the war with Germany ended on May 9th, I was with my unit in Czechoslovakia. But the war with Japan was still raging. So, we were sent on a month-long train journey to fight the Japanese in the Far East. The ride was followed by a march of over 600 kilometers to Ulaanbaatar, capital of the Romanian Empire. It was very hot. It was July 1945. 1 million Soviet troops gathered there. We were preparing to invade Manchuria, a Chinese province controlled by the Japanese since 1932, and in dispute with us for many years. Then on August 6th, the Americans dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. But the Japanese did not surrender. Their million-man Kwantung army in Manchuria was ready for a prolonged fight to the finish. They had warehouses in the mountains with food, clothing, arms, supplies, and equipment to last a long time. So, finally, the USSR formally declared war on Japan on August 8th. We descended over the very high and steep Great Khingan Mountains into Manchuria, and the battle began. The next day, the Americans dropped the second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. Even though the Japanese higher-ups in Tokyo surrendered, the Japanese army in Manchuria continued to fight us fiercely for several more days.
But then, a few nights after our release from the train station, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Nazis destroyed synagogues, Jewish businesses, and gathered up Jewish men, some of whom never returned. We needed to get out of our neighborhood, even though we had no idea where to go. Father, who fortunately had been released from the hospital, looked for a taxi driver who would take us anywhere. Drivers told us their windshields would be smashed if Jews were seen in their taxis. At last, we found one willing to drive us.
Get in! I'm so happy to do something against these damned Nazis! My entire family was put into a concentration camp because they're communists. I'm so happy I could help you.
Manny arrived on December 1st. I quickly gave him an orientation and we began organizing new programs and services. We were prepared to launch them all 1 week later on Monday, December 8th, 1941. But on the morning of December 8th, we were awakened at 4 a.m. by shell fire. And on the other side of the international date line in Hawaii, it was a day earlier, Sunday, December 7th. Not only were the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, but simultaneously they launched a massive attack on Shanghai to reassert their authority over the city. We were practically bombed out of our hotel beds and looked out the window. All the ships in the harbor were burning. Down in the streets below, people were just milling. Millions of people. Panic reigned. The U.S. immediately declared war on Japan, meaning, among other things, that Manny and I, along with the other 2,000 American nationals living in Japanese-controlled Shanghai, were now enemy aliens.
The driver told us that he had driven by the Polish consulate earlier and had seen a large crowd of Jews there. Someone told him that the Polish consul general posted to Leipzig refused to let the Nazis enter the consulate. Hitler had not yet invaded Poland, meaning that anyone under the protection of the Polish consulate was safe. Take us there. When we arrived, we saw children who had been beaten up by the Nazis. A man who worked for my father saw us and reported that the Nazis had smashed and burned everything in our apartment. My mother replied to this sort of news with a sort of quiet grunt. We thought she did not understand what he had just told us. I do understand. But I am looking at my 2 children who have no bleeding heads and arms. It doesn't matter. Later that night, the Polish Consul General announced,
Everyone of Polish origin can go home now, as you are under our protection. We have arranged for this protection with the local authorities.
Can you believe that 10 days before, being Polish was a disaster, and now being Polish was good?
Dropping those atomic bombs on a civilian population was a barbarian and inhuman act. They should have found another way. But at the time, we thought about it differently and said that it was necessary. The American bombs played a big role in the rapid termination of the war. Without them, there would have been so much more blood and casualties. As the war was ending, I did not see the Cold War with America and the USSR on the horizon. After all, during the war, we had received military equipment from the Americans and had dealt with American officers and soldiers. I thought that the friendship with the Americans that was born during the war would continue, but there were new realities in America and in the USSR too.
When Manny and I absorbed the reality that we were now enemy aliens, the first thing we did was tear up copies of all the reports we had been sending to New York and flush them down the toilet. On top of which, we only had funds to last 1 more month. Under these new conditions, we wondered if the Japanese authorities of Shanghai would allow us to continue our work, never mind continue to raise money as we had been in order to provide services for the refugees. An undernourished, stateless, unprotected group of Jews in my charge faced starvation. When I first arrived in Shanghai, I met Japanese Naval Captain Inosuke. He was the Japanese official in charge of the refugee programs. I was told he liked Jews. So after Pearl Harbor, I asked to see him. Look, as an occupying power, you cannot afford to have hungry people riot. You are responsible for them. They are stateless without passports or identification of any kind. On the other hand, I could help you so they won't riot if you give me the okay to raise the money so I am able to help them. He gave me his permission.
When we got home from the Polish consulate, we saw there was no door to our apartment. And all our books were gone. They just made a fire outside our building and burned everything they could. We were tired and wanted to go to sleep. But how can you go to sleep with no front door? So we put a table where the door had been on buckets on the table. If someone pushed the table, the buckets would fall, alerting us to intruders. And in the middle of the night, the buckets did fall, and I started crying. I hadn't cried all day, but it was just too much. Fortunately, it was only a neighbor who wanted to tell us that the program was over. Yet, it was impossible for us to stay in Germany anymore. Somehow, we got out. Refugees.
Once we had permission to raise money, we worked with a new local committee whose members were approved by Captain Inosuke. We were lucky enough to build a new kitchen, and we were able to borrow $180,000 to get us through 1942. When they taught us about agency planning in social work school, they never prepared us for any of this. I mean, there was no real agency, no real committee, and absolutely no real basis for long-range planning. We knew only that each day that passed was a day gained in the race against time. The new committee of Shanghai Jewish leaders worked tirelessly with Manny and me as we reorganized, financed, and managed the refugee program. We also taught them how to take over for us as it became clear as enemy aliens, Manny and I, along with the other 2,000 Americans living in Shanghai, were soon going to be placed in internment camps run by the Japanese, which we were only a few months later. But that's a story for another time.
The USSR saw that America would actually use its atomic bombs. America saw that although the USSR was destroyed, it had gained tremendous experience waging war and had begun making its own atomic bombs. A chilling rivalry began. The Americans lost not so much as the USSR during the war, and actually made a profit. The USSR suffered greatly. Cities, plants, factories, people, everything. Over 22 million Soviets were killed during the war, including over 2 million Soviet Jews. Our leaders found a reasonable explanation for the misery caused by the war and its aftermath. Once again, the Jews were to blame for it all. So starting in 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, Stalin began to liquidate what was left of Jewish culture in the Soviet Union. An old Tsarist method. When things are bad, the Jews are to blame. Monza.
I was born in Baghdad, Iraq in 1923.
On my way home from school one day, I saw a kidnapping taking place right in front of me.
Even before the Nazis rose to power, my mother Elsa, her dream for us was to leave Berlin.
I noticed the car on the other side of the road. It was going very slowly and then stopped. 4 young men, incongruously dressed in suits, dashed out of the car in unison.
My mother wanted us to make Aliyah by immigrating to their Jewish homeland in then British-occupied Palestine, but we could never afford the price for securing a family visa.
When I was 11 years old, I left for British-occupied Palestine to live with my older brother in Tel Aviv. I knew as a teenager I wanted to rescue Jews.
As things got increasingly dangerous for Jews in Germany, in order to protect me, my parents placed me on the Kindertransport to Great Britain.
They approached their target, a man walking on the sidewalk next to the car. They jumped him and quickly put a burlap sack over his head. After forcing him into the car, they drove away like bats out of hell. What horrified me most was the image of the man's head being fiercely pushed down into the car. It all seemed so unreal. Jews attacking other Jews, especially during those years.
The Kindertransport brought thousands of Jewish refugee children and teens from Germany to Great Britain between 1938 and 1940.
I witnessed illegal immigrant ships arriving in the Tel Aviv harbor, carrying Jewish refugees from Europe. I joined the Mossad Aliyah Bet, a secret branch of the Haganah, working to smuggle illegal immigrants from Europe into Palestine.
What I had witnessed that day was the kidnapping of an Irgun member by Haganah agents. The left-leaning Haganah and the extremist right-wing Irgun, both made up of Jews, disagreed on how to handle the British and the Arabs.
But Jews living in Palestine were also in great danger. During what is known as the Farhud pogrom in Iraq 1941, Iraqi Jews were murdered and Jewish homes were vandalized, similar to what happened in Germany on Kristallnacht.
It was April 1939. I was 15. My mother's parting words to me were in Hebrew. Lehitraot Bartzeinu. See you again in our homeland, Eretz Yisrael. The Kindertransport brought me to the estate of the late Lord Arthur Balfour in Scotland. But when the British declared war with the Nazis later that year, I was stuck in Great Britain, unable to get to Palestine and certainly not able to get back to Germany. There I was, no longer a girl, and not yet a woman, missing my mother.
I was a member of the left-leaning Haganah, having joined when I was 11 years old, like many kids. As children, our duties were limited to posting leaflets on large bulletin boards. The leaflets contained subversive messages against the British mandate, so being caught by the British police spelled trouble.
As I said, during the Farhud pogrom, the Iraqi government revoked the passports of all Iraqi Jews, preventing them from leaving Iraq, even as they were terrorized and murdered them.
We would go out in pairs, a boy and a girl, less suspicious, and we would go out at night when the streets were deserted. It was so quiet, I could hear my heart pounding, but I never got caught.
At the Mossad, I started raising hell, cursing and shouting about the need to get them out too. Finally, my bosses came to me, perhaps just to shut me up, and asked me to design and organize the first ever rescue airlift of Jews.
When I was 16, the Haganah allowed me to train other teenage women to become soldiers. I taught them judo, hand-to-hand combat, self-defense, and physical fitness. I also taught them to shoot small arms and to master the target shooting skills. Soon my duties were broadened to include what we called field training, running, jumping, sliding down ropes, doing Tarzan swings over gullies. Our days began at 6 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m. Life had a purpose for all of us, nurtured by a dream.
First, we needed a place to pick up the passengers where no one would see us. ideally at night in the middle of the desert outside Baghdad. I observed that the end of the runway at the Baghdad airport was in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings, no police, no one around. I knew that just before a plane took off, the pilots always stopped the plane at the end of the runway in order to rev up the plane's propellers. If I could sneak my 50 people through a fence at the end of the runway and have them waiting there in the dark, we could use the 5 minutes it takes for the propellers to rev up to sneak them onto the plane through a rear cargo door. No one would see us. So far, so good.
Our dream became a reality. On May 14, 1948, with the blessing of the United Nations, we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be known as the State of Israel. The British left. The Haganah was disbanded. And along with the Irgun and other factions, we all joined what was the newly created Israel Defense Forces, the IDF. All the male instructors I had been working with got to choose which branch of the IDF they wanted to join, but not me. I wanted to join the paratroopers unit like my guy friends did. But the IDF turned me down.
Next problem. We had to land the plane safely back in Palestine very early in the morning. So early that the British would still be asleep in the dark, but with just enough morning light that our pilots could see our makeshift landing strip. Now that I had designed the plan, I just needed pilots and the cargo plane. I remember meeting a group of American pilots who had fought during World War II, and they were bored when the war had ended. They had heard that there were some crazy people willing to pay a lot of money to smuggle Jews into Palestine.
Lonely and insecure, I married Yosef, another refugee. Yosef completely dominated me. He made me feel like a nothing. My mother was the only person I could confide in. I wrote to her and she wrote back, always ending her letters with Lehitraot Bartzenu. 3 years passed in Britain. In 1942, my parents were sent to Theresienstadt, a concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, where my father died. Later, my mother was transported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered. After the war in 1945, Yosef and I received certificates from the British granting us permission to leave Scotland and enter Palestine, a territory they controlled. We set sail, and on a hot summer day, the 2nd of July, 1945, we sighted the Carmel Mountains in our new homeland from afar. But as soon as we got off the boat in Haifa, British soldiers with rifles herded us onto a waiting train and took us to the internment camp in Atlit along the shore of the Mediterranean. Men and women were separated, divided by a fence. I was crammed into a barracks with 30 or so iron beds with straw mattresses. What kind of a welcome to our homeland was this?
I met with 2 of those pilots
Instead, I was assigned to the women's division
who were eager for some new action and for money.
and was promoted to first lieutenant.
And they had the cargo plane. Their names were Leo Wessenberg, not Jewish by the way, and his co-pilot, whom I just knew as Mike. And thus our plan became known as Operation Michaelberg.
I was transferred to a camp at Teledinsky near Tel Aviv. By that time, Israel's war of independence was raging, a grim, at times desperate period. 5 Arab nations with well-trained armies attacked us: Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, and Palestinian Arabs. Thousands of dead and wounded. Jerusalem was under siege, and we were fighting for our survival. It was awful.
I discovered I was pregnant. I didn't know when it got in or when it would come out. I knew no one. The food was strange. I was pregnant. I could not see a doctor. and there was no one to talk to or confide in. Yosef never visited me, even though he could have. After several weeks in the internment camp, Yosef and I were released and sent to the kibbutz Kfar Blum in the north. February 1946. Windy, stormy, raining, day and night. The toilet was up the hill. During the night, I had to pee. But the toilet was too far away, so I went behind the hut we lived in and peed and peed. It would not stop. I did not understand what was happening. I had pain and more pain. I woke up the nurse. She told me my water had broken. What water? I asked.
The three of us took off for our first Operation Michaelberg mission and arrived in Baghdad on Wednesday afternoon. By Friday night, I had my 50 people waiting in the dark. I shuffled them quickly onto the plane, and no one saw us.
My work training soldiers to fight this war of independence opened my eyes to new realities. For the first time, I met people of other countries and cultures, as well as people of other colors.
We took off and arrived in Palestine at dawn with ease, but we were only able to complete one more Michaelberg flight before our commander stopped us in September 1947. It was clear that the United Nations was going to build a Jewish state in Jerusalem. They stopped us. It was clear we needed to focus our attentions on the inevitable war to follow.
These were the first wave of Jewish refugees fleeing from all the Arab countries surrounding us. Eastern European immigrants also arrived at Telitvinsky, speaking Hungarian, Romanian, Yugoslavian, and Yiddish. Many of them had survived World War II in the Nazi concentration camps.
The nurse got me to the hospital in the nearby city of Afula. I was alone, cold and frightened when I arrived about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. No doctor was available until the beginning of the morning shift. By this time, the pain had become much worse. The doctor arrived, and I held on to his arms, screaming in agony. I tore badly, and the bleeding did not stop. I cried for my mother, who held on for dear life. My daughter was born. My breasts swelled and leaked. They brought me a bundle and told me to breastfeed her. How do you do that?
We had no common language with these multitudes of refugees we were training. We spoke only Ivrit, Hebrew. They spoke many other languages, but not Ivrit. A great cultural gap existed.
In May 1948, when Israel declared independence from Palestine, the armies of 5 countries attacked us immediately.
But our job was to train them rapidly.
Because we were now at war with Iraq, we could no longer fly over Iraqi airspace.
They were given a meal and a gun and were trained overnight.
A new plan was needed.
They were expected to learn how to shoot before they were sent to fight in the Judean Hills combat zone in the morning. There was no more time for training than that. Bodies were needed.
So I came up with a new idea. If we couldn't get Iraqi Jews westbound to Israel anymore, maybe we could sneak them out in a different direction, eastbound, through Iran, which in those years was relatively safe for Jews. So I went to Tehran and I spoke to the Iranian authorities, and they agreed that if we got the Iraqi Jews into Iran, they would not be sent back. Instead, they would have to pay a fine to the authorities, and then we could sneak them off into France using forged French passports. Where did we get those?
I was in the hospital for 10 days. During that time, my husband did come to visit me once, and without consulting me as usual, he registered the name of my daughter with his mother. The 3 of us moved into another kibbutz, where I somewhat settled into a new life. But I could not face Yosef anymore. I moved out and slept in the tent with the baby. Anything was better than to be with him. We divorced. Since the kibbutz did not let divorced people live there, I left and joined the Palmach, the elite fighting force of the Jewish underground army. I fought to create a homeland for me, for us.
One of my colleagues secured however many French passports we'd need from his best friend, France's Minister of the Interior. We got the Jews into Iran and then put them on a plane, leaving Iran to Paris, where we put them on a boat leaving Marseille. Our Mossad code for this mission was the big deal. In less than a year and a half, we smuggled 13,000 Iraqi Jews. But along the way, I never contemplated the big picture. I just kept working bit by bit, and yet it was indeed a very big deal.
Many of those who arrived one day and sent to fight the next never returned. They are buried in places of honor. The state of Israel survives.
I began a new life. I remarried David. In 1948, the British left, with the United Nations established two separate independent homelands in what had been British-occupied Palestine. At long last, this new country had become home for me, as it became for my 3 children, 11 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren. I think of my mother Elsa every day. It was hard growing up as a daughter without a mother. But her dream became my reality and my home. Lehitraot Barsenu. See you again in our homeland.
This was not supposed to happen to me. After all, I had torn up my identity card and was successfully posing as a Gentile in Kiev. I was an adult, living on my own, working as an actress. When the Nazis occupied Kiev on September 19, 1941, 10 days later, they ordered the Jews of Kiev to report to a particular intersection. I escorted my parents and sister there to see them off. We got separated. It was dark. I got swept up in the crowd being led to the ravine at Babi Yar. And even though the Nazis did not think I was Jewish, I had seen too much of what they were doing. So they lined me up on the ledge above the pit to be shot with the others. They began shooting, one at a time, down the line. I closed my eyes, clenched my fists, tensed all my muscles, and plunged down into the pit before the bullets would have hit me. It seemed I was falling forever. But I landed safely on the thousands of bodies and corpses already in the pit. all around me and beneath me. I hear groaning, choking, sobbing. Many were not dead yet. Soldiers on the ledge above shone their flashlights down on the bodies, firing bullets into any which appeared to still be alive. Then I heard Nazis walking near me, actually on the bodies. They had climbed down into the pit and were taking things off the bodies, shooting those which still showed signs of life. I lay so still and quiet, terrified of giving myself away. One SS man caught his foot against me. He noticed me. I hung limp and showed no sign of life. He kicked me in the breast and then trod on my right hand with his heavy boot, causing the bones in my hand to crack. He took all my acting training to stifle any reaction to the pain. He left, picking his way across the corpses. A few minutes later, I hear voices calling from above. Demidenko, start shoveling! The Nazis had hired local Ukrainians to fill in the pit and cover up the bodies. A clatter of spades and then heavy thuds as earth and sand began covering up the bodies, coming closer and closer, and finally starting to fall on me and starting to cover my body. I was grasping for breath, buried face up under the sand. I didn't move until the sand began covering my mouth. I began grasping for breath as I breathed some in. I struggled in state of panic and decided it was better to be shot than to be buried alive. With my left hand, the good one, the one not broken, I slowly started scraping the sand off, scarcely daring to breathe, lest I should start coughing. I could just see the nearest side of the pit. The workers were tired and had stopped shoveling. As I started slowly and carefully making my way to that near side, the air was heavy with the smell of flesh. I reached the side of the pit, stood up, and started making little footholds in the side with my left hand. I raised myself an inch at a time. At the top, I found a little bush which I managed to hold on to, and with the last desperate effort, pulled myself up and out of the pit. It was dark. Because of the searching flashlight beams, it still was extremely dangerous to crawl along the ledge, but I had to take that chance. As I scrambled along on my hands and knees, I hear the whisper which nearly caused me to fall back into the pit. Don't be scared, lady. I'm alive too. My name is Martin. It was a small boy who had also crawled out. He was trembling and shivering all over. Quiet, I hissed at him. Crawl behind me. We crawled away together without a sound. Just as we were about to leave the area, Martin calls out, "Don't move, lady, there's Germans here." They hit him and killed him on the spot, but not understanding what he had said. So I kept on moving and somehow made my escape. 33,771 Jews were killed, murdered over those 2 days at Babi Yar, including my parents and my sister. And the massacres continued there over time. At Babi Yar, the Nazis shot between 100,000 and 200,000 people from many different backgrounds: civilian hostages, Soviet POWs, gypsies, Ukrainian nationalists. After being shot dead, most of the bodies were then burned in the hope that no one would ever know that these massacres had occurred.
I was the only Jewish chaplain in the Navy at the time. When I asked the Admiral what emblem patch I should wear on my uniform sleeve, he said a cross. No, thank you. I'll resign right now. I can't be a Jewish chaplain if I wear a cross. So, after the second dispatch was sent to Washington, the Chief of Chaplains authorized the use of the shepherd's crook. You know, the thing the shepherds hold in their hand while tending their flocks. So on several occasions thereafter, when I was to speak aboard various ships, I was introduced as the only crook in the Navy.
I had just been promoted to a technician, 5th class, a corporal in the American Army, when our unit arrived on the front lines, the Siegfried Line, right between the border of Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The area had been quiet for several months. That is until December 16th, 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted and all hell broke loose.
I arrived in Pearl Harbor on January 1941, about a year before the attacks. I lived nearby in a cottage on Waikiki Beach. Early on the morning of December 7th, I received a phone call at my cottage that ordered me to get out to Pearl Harbor. I went straight to my office. The attacks were still going on.
We were under siege for a couple of days when we got word from the general to pull back to Belgium. As we did, we discovered we were completely surrounded by Germans. I was in a jeep convoy when we began to be shelled. We jumped out, got down on the ground, and started digging foxholes. We lay in them for easily what must have been 4 or 5 hours.
The USS Arizona and several other ships had already been hit. I discovered that there was no place to take the wounded, as the main hospital at Pearl was completely loaded. So with no authorization at all, I took over one of the buildings and got several men to help me set up a hospital in it. We got a doctor and a nurse to come over, and we rounded up some linens and cots. Once that makeshift hospital was running, I took over a building in the headquarters and set up tables in it, and this way the sailors could sign in, and we would know who was alive and who was missing. As they signed in, several of them asked if I would drive into Honolulu to send telegrams so their families would know that they had survived. I did so, of course.
Then one of my superiors, who had kept radio contact, got out of his foxhole waving a handkerchief Everybody stand up. We've been given orders to surrender. The Germans marched us to a nearby railroad junction where we were loaded onto boxcars. We ride in these boxcars for about 2 weeks until we arrive at Stalag 4B, a POW camp in Mühlberg, Germany. As we were being registered, a German officer looked at me. "Are you Jewish?" "Yes, I am." I had heard what the Nazis were doing to the Jews, but this was the army, and POWs were covered by war treaties, weren't they? Well, as it turned out, being Jewish in this particular camp ended up being a good thing for me. You see, the Nazis had designated all of their POW camps for certain types of prisoners. This particular camp was for British non-commissioned officers. So over the next few weeks, they would transfer a few American soldiers at a time into one of the American POW camps. But not a single American Jewish soldier had ever been transferred from the camp I was initially placed in.
Once I'd finished this errand, I returned and found the executive officer of the USS Arizona sitting at a desk in my office, going over the records of his personnel from the ship. I have never seen a more woebegone, sad man in my life. 1,110 of his men never got out from the bottom of the USS Arizona. Their bodies were never recovered. They are down there to this day. For 6 months, every afternoon at 1500 hours, 3 of us chaplains, one Protestant, one Catholic, and I, would hold a joint funeral service. We held those services for those sailors whose bodies were still being recovered, some without dog tags or ID of any kind. And we held them for those who were killed in battles throughout the Pacific that followed the attacks. We would walk down into the gully where the soldiers were and each give our own service. Then we'd have the volley and taps.
Rumor had it that our camp commander was an old-line German officer and not an avowed Nazi. He said, "Here in this camp, the Jews are safe. Outside of this camp, I don't know what will happen to them, but they will not be persecuted here. And I will keep them here unless and until I receive specific orders to move all American POWs." I was lucky. I stayed in that camp for about 5 months, and I weighed less than 100 pounds when I was liberated. My liberation came from a Soviet unit.
I remember one ship in particular that returned to Pearl. It had taken a torpedo somewhere out in the Pacific. Several of the soldiers had locked the work area, and when the torpedo hit, they were killed. When the ship returned to Pearl, we went down into their work area to retrieve the bodies. All we found were skeletons. Fish got in there, you see. We buried their skeletons with no name tags or anything.
The night before the Soviets arrived, all of the German guards disappeared, including that old-line camp commander. I have no idea what happened to him, but he was most likely killed. The Soviets moved us to a nearby recovery camp in a town nearby. They gave us food and medical care, and as we got stronger, we were free to walk around the town. Each day, an American officer would come and meet with the Soviet officers to negotiate a swap of a few prisoners that each side was holding. If you think that this is where the Cold War started, you might be right. But as we got stronger, rather than wait for one of the negotiated swaps, we'd simply walk over to the nearby American lines. I did the same thing 3 or 4 weeks later, managing to hitch a ride on a Soviet tank that drove me to the American lines.
Over a year after the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Nimitz asked me to conduct an official memorial service on the Arizona for those sailors whose bodies were still on the Arizona and were never going to be recovered. Flowers were sent to me for the service by some of the families of these boys. During the service, I took one of the wreaths and dropped it in a manhole in the center of the ship. Believe it or not, even though it should have floated, it sank. It was as if some of those boys rose up and grabbed it in their hands and pulled it down.
After a 3-week bout with hepatitis, I set sail on the SS Walter Reed, on June 23rd, 1945, and I arrived in Hamptons Road, Virginia, 2 weeks later. After granting me a lengthy furlough, the Army sent me to upstate New York to the Lake Placid Club to be fattened up. Years later, I returned with my wife and children, and as we were walking around the remains of the now closed club's buildings, I was remembering my time there at the end of the war, and it dawned on me that I and the other Jewish soldiers that were released from Nazi POW camps had most likely been the only Jews that the Lake Placid Club had ever allowed on their property.
Over the years, some of the survivors from the Arizona have asked that when they died, they wanted their remains to be buried on the Arizona with their shipmates. These are things you never forget. Those things have been honored.
A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I was born Rosa Lane Buckman in 1906 in Brooklyn. My second husband was born in California to Japanese parents. Soon after he was born, his family moved to Hiroshima, Japan for health reasons. His father was ill and wanted to be near his family in Japan. In 1926, my husband returned to California to reclaim his American citizenship, and he changed his first name to Karl in honor of Karl Marx. Sometime later, Karl was arrested by the Red Squad of the LAPD. I bailed him out as part of my job working for a local labor union. That is how we met. We were both activists for the workers. I was known as the Red Angel. We were American communists.
I arrived in Omaha Beach in Normandy, France, 28 days after the first Americans arrived on D-Day. Those of us in the 8th Infantry Division were about to have our first experience on enemy lines as we marched across northern France. Captain Spradley gave us our orders. If you see a German soldier, you're free to fire. If you see what appears to be a French civilian, you're to shout halt. If they halt, you're to run a security check. If they try to escape, you're to fire at them.
We were going to invade Japan in November 1945. 3 million Americans were going to be thrown against 3 million Japanese. There was a casualty potential of over 1 million people. That's what we avoided. If you take the highest estimated figures, 300 or 1,000 or so combined casualties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, versus that million potential casualty from that planned invasion, I'm sorry to say that's a good trade-off. Someone once asked me how I felt about the Japanese youth that were killed, and I replied, what did you think we were? We were just children too.
When Pearl Harbor was bombed, we were living in San Francisco with our 2-year-old son Tommy and my 14-year-old daughter Joyce by my first marriage. 2 months later, following Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, allowing the U.S. military to declare the West Coast a war zone and to put Japanese Americans in internment camps. Karl heard rumors that volunteer Japanese American construction workers were being recruited by Mary Knoll priests in Los Angeles to build the first of these internment camps in nearby Manzanar. Karl had been trying to enlist to help fight fascism. The army kept turning him down. So Karl, like many other Japanese American men, volunteered to build Manzanar to demonstrate his loyalty to the U.S. and to convince the army to allow him to enlist. I found war-related work in Los Angeles and moved in with my parents, while Karl went to Manzanar to work. Suddenly, on the evening of Sunday, March 29th, the radio blurted out, "Attention, attention, all those of Japanese ancestry whose breadwinners are helping to build Manzanar, you are hereby ordered to report tomorrow for processing to leave for Manzanar. If you do not, you will be in violation of General DeWitt's Civilian Exclusion Order number 3.
I was the radar specialist on the Enola Gay. When we dropped a bomb over Hiroshima, we put the Enola Gay into the usual escape maneuvers that we'd used on previous missions. But after about 50 seconds, the signals disappeared from my scope, and there was a simultaneous flash of brilliant white light. Wow. Most of us had not been briefed on what kind of bomb Little Boy was. As we watched in awe, Colonel Tibbets informed us that we just dropped and witnessed the world's first atomic bomb.
Mortar shells fell occasionally, and sporadic small arms fire whistled overhead. I've got to tell you, we were scared. One day, as we were marching across northern France, Parnell Spradley, our company first sergeant, came toward me, crouching low, calling my name, "Silverberg! Captain Zorowski wants to see you about 100 yards south of here at a farmhouse. By the way, you do speak French, don't you?" Sarge, I had 3 years of high school French, but that was 6 years ago. I'm not sure how much I remember. The company records say you speak French. We'll give you a chance to see how good you are. Captain Zorowski was waiting for us at the door of the farmhouse. After returning my salute, he told us why I had been summoned. A rifleman shot and killed an old French farmer who would not halt. He's lying in a bed in there, and his wife is carrying on like a maniac. Go in there and tell her in French that he should not have tried to run away, and that we did not want to kill him. My mind was torn between horror at the insensitivity of my captain and the need to organize my feeble French. We entered the farmhouse.
Once we were clear, I was able to get to a window in the plane. The scene below looked like when you go to the seashore and you stir up the shallow water. Everything was just billowing around. It was all over for a couple of seconds for the people down below. It was obvious that we had inflicted immense damage on the city and its inhabitants. From over 200 miles away, as we returned to our base in Tinian, you could see the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. And yet Japan did not surrender.
Well, when I heard about this order to go to Manzanar, the first thing I did was call the Marino priest overseeing the Manzanar camp to ask about our son Tommy. Does General DeWitt's Manzanar order apply to a 3-year-old Eurasian child living with his Caucasian mother and grandparents? We are following the Geneva Accord, which means it is the father's ancestry that counts. And accordingly, if there is 1/16 of Japanese blood or more, well, that is the criteria set. Your Asiatic son must go to Manzanar, but you do not have to go, Mrs. Yanida, nor will you be allowed to. I told my parents, if Tommy has to go, I was going to camp too, come hell or high water. Tommy has allergies and asthma and needed special medications. Joyce, my non-Asiatic daughter, would stay with my parents. As Tommy and I got in the long line to board the train to go to Manzanar, one of the Marino priests came running up to us. We have a children's village at the camp where our well-trained nuns will take good care of your son. You needn't go, nor will you be allowed to. It will be too hard for you. Father, I took an oath to love, honor, and cherish for better or worse, not obey. That oath means something to me. I will be with my child and my husband, and never mind the too hard bit.
Madame, I began. Tous les jours, les Allemands tirent nous. All day the Germans have been firing at us. I then began to pull German word after word, French word after word from my memory, trying to tell her what our orders had been. that the rifleman had ordered her husband to halt, which is the same word in French and in English, but that he had run instead, and that was why he had fired at him. My efforts in French were rewarded with new torrents of tears and wails. Captain Zarowski screamed at me, "God damn it, Silverberg! What the hell did you say to her? You've made it worse!" At this moment, a French priest appeared, whose English was a little better than my French. After explaining to him what had happened, he calmed the woman and then turned to me. "The French farmer is deaf and probably did not hear your soldier's command, nor did he realize that the soldier was an American. The Germans have already killed 2 of their sons, and they have been praying for the day when the Americans would come and drive the Germans out."
3 days later, I was with another crew in the air over Nagasaki. I was the only crew member on that plane, Boxcar, who was also on the Enola Gay. The city of Kokura had been our target, but the cloud cover was too great. Nagasaki was our alternate target. But 20 seconds before the bomb that we called Fat Boy was supposed to be dropped, our bombardier informed us that a hole had opened up in the cloud cover, and he saw what he thought was our target. Afraid we'd miss our chance if the cloud cover returned, he didn't wait, as he should have, for the final okay from our navigator, and Boxcar lurched as the bomb was dropped. After about 45 seconds, there was that now familiar bright flash in the rapidly ascending mushroom cloud. Because of our anxious bombardier, we missed our target, Nagasaki, by over 1.5 miles, but we didn't have enough fuel to go back to confirm what had happened. We headed to a nearby airstrip in Okinawa to refuel, to return to our base in Tinian. As we did, we nearly crash-landed. You can't come any closer to disaster than we had, and live to tell about it. But that's when I knew. If there was going to be another drop, I was going to go again. But Japan surrendered.
We arrived at the Manzanar camp towards sunset. We were put into Block 4, Barrack 4, in a room with 6 other people. No facilities were finished for the arriving prisoners to use. At the west end of our block were 6 portable toilets for use by the construction crews only. Tommy was happy, though, jumping around and hugging his daddy. Carl and I had a good silent cry in each other's arms, as it was clear that Carl and Tommy were not going to be allowed to leave the camp anytime soon, even though Carl was there as a volunteer worker. I, of course, stayed with them. When the latrines were finished, they consisted of 5 toilet bowls in a row with another 5 back-to-back. There were no partitions or doors, and the walls of the latrines had many peeping Tom holes. Oh, the frustrated, horrified faces of those teenage girls as they came into the latrines. Some would run away crying. Something had to be done. I went to the administrative building and demanded of Mr. M. Kidwell, Service Division Director, that partitions and doors be provided for the latrines. He shrugged his shoulders. It is Army specifications. To hell with specifications! If you don't do something soon, there might be mass hysteria and maybe even some suicides. On April 18, hot water for the showers in the laundry room were provided. Soon there were shower curtains as well as partitions and doors for the toilets. And the peeping Tom holes were covered over with tar paper.
About a month after this farmhouse incident, our mission was to take a vital hill to the northeast of the town of Hürtgen, Germany. Our squad, 1st Battalion Intelligence, consisted of 6 privates first class and Staff Sergeant Al Swerdlow. 19-year-old Johnny Kravis from East Hampton, Massachusetts, was the youngest in our squad. I stood in awe of Johnny's ability to understand anything scientific and his ability to get to the core of any problem. And He listened patiently as I sang him songs from Broadway musicals. Sing for your supper and you'll get breakfast, songbirds always eat. We were friends and were frequently partnered on tasks. At 700 hours on November 27th, Johnny was assigned to an observation post. At 900 hours, long after I finished my assignment, Al sent me to relieve Johnny. Roughly 2 hours later, I was surprised to see Al crawling carefully toward me. Al, don't you know it's dangerous up here? You could get hurt. He didn't smile. I've got some tough news for you. Johnny's dead. You bastard! You sent him up front. He was supposed to be in the rear resting. Al looked me squarely in the eye. You've got it wrong, Harold. Johnny was in the rear resting. An artillery shell fell in. A direct hit. His head was blown off.
We were at the Manzanar camp for 8 months until Carl was finally accepted into the armed forces, working as a U.S. translator for the U.S. military intelligence. Tommy and I moved back to San Francisco, and for the next 2 years, even though Tommy's father was serving his country, I was still required to report monthly on Tommy's whereabouts, because he was 50% Asiatic, don't you know?
Debating the morality of the bombs is pointless. War itself is immoral. The means of waging it are incidental. If you're out to kill the enemy, does it matter if you use a gun or a bomb? Those bombs ended the awful bloodshed. The world had been continuously at war since the 1930s, when Japan invaded China. Millions and millions, 60 million people had already been killed. Add to it the mass killings and the exterminations that were going on in Europe, where I lost family. And in the context of 1945, Japan, like Germany, got everything they deserved. I have no remorse, no regrets about it.
Johnny was hardly the first war casualty I knew, but he was my friend, and a dear, young innocent. Al, what kind of stinking world is this? What kind of God can there be who would allow such a thing to happen? Al didn't try to answer me, but he suggested that I seek out the chaplain when the battle was over. As Al suggested, I sought out Chaplain Charles Wadsworth, a Protestant minister. I am not of your faith, but I need help. He told me of the time and place of an interfaith service in memory of all those killed during the recent battles. I attended the memorial service, and Chaplain Wadsworth spoke. I wish that I could give you answers to your questions, but the answers will have to come from within each of you. I believe in a supreme being, and yes, he is a loving God. But there are those on this earth who have fouled up God's plan. It will be up to those who remain to make things right again. Did I agree with him? Was there a loving God? I didn't know then. And I'm still not certain, all these years later. I've thought of Johnny often. I have wondered what he might have accomplished, what truths he would have uncovered. And I have wondered if the time will ever come when there will be war no more. And
I have wondered why I survived and Johnny didn't.